So, standard economics coupled with a common institutional framework. We have common institutions, again, as I mentioned, one central bank, one banking commission. This is something even before, I mean, as you see, it's just right now that the European Union is having the equivalent of a single banking commission. This region has had one banking commission, common banking supervision, common banking regulation since its inception. So we have a common institutional framework, including a common monetary policy implemented by the regional central bank, and we have a common external tariff. And we have also a common currency, and as a result of this common institutional framework, the currency that we have is one of the key elements of regional integration, right? And it comes with some advantages. For example, sharing a common currency, as the euro does for the eurozone, reduces transaction costs and promotes intra-regional trade. And there have been some efforts to support this intra-regional trade through, by removing tariffs and quantitative restrictions on intra-regional trade. We also have a common external tariff since the year 2000, and as a result, the data show that in West Africa, actually in the sub-Saharan African region, this West African and Monetary Union has the highest level of intra-regional trade. So I'll show you some data on that. First data shows just the level of intra-regional trade, and you see up there the highest line is the Western African Monetary Union. Another data, this one is from SWIFT. So if you have ever transferred money from your bank to another bank, those transfers go through the SWIFT system, where commercial banks, it's like a hub and spoke mechanism where commercial banks can make transfers. So we had data on the SWIFT transactions, and then if you look at the Western African Monetary Union, which is the bar with the highest yellow, the most yellow, which is the 4th. It's the 4th from the top. You see in yellow the proportion of SWIFT SWIFT figures that are using the CFA franc, basically. So this is within region trade, and this is the highest in Africa. It's about 58%. And if you look at other regions, if you want to trade between a Kenyan, like a Kenyan firm and let's say a Rwandan firm, because you have two different currencies, you have to go through a US dollar, right? And you have to go through a clearing bank to settle your trade. And in this region, because of the common currency, because of the CFA franc, it's not necessary. We also have another benefit, one of the benefits, it's the growth of Pan-African banking, starting with banks like EcoBank, which is headquartered in Lomé, Togo, and which is now over time has expanded outside the region and has a big network. So it helps to have a common currency when you want to have a Pan-African banking group. Just imagine if you are the treasurer of, I don't know, a bank that has businesses in Zambia, in South Africa, in Togo, in Rwanda, and then what do you do with all this portfolio of currencies? how do you manage the currency risk, right? So, like when I talk to some treasurers at EcoBank, for example, they tell me we don't hedge. We don't hedge it that way. It's just too expensive to hedge all these African currencies. So if you are in this region also, because of the CFA franc, the currency risk between the trades across intra-regionally is zero. So, still, in spite of these encouraging figures of intra-regional trade and financial integration, we are not there yet, right? So if you compare with other regions like the EU or ASEAN, intra-regional trade is still lower. Why? Well, one could argue that non-tariff barriers also impede intra-regional trade. If you drive a truck from Dakar all the way to Kita, in neighboring country, in Mali, how long will it take? You know, how costly is it? How many bribes will you have to pay? So we have costly border procedures, we have weak governance, we have also inadequate transport infrastructure, poor business environment, and sometimes there is a big difference between the de jure agreements and the de facto implementations. So, bottom line, as a tool to promote regional integration, the CFA franc has been useful, but more work needs to be done. It's just one tool, and we have to complement it with other measures. And I guess this will be maybe the one takeaway I have from my presentation. CFA franc will be one tool with some pros and cons, but it's just one tool. In any case, it needs always to be complemented with other policies. So, in the future, we have also a project to integrate through ECOWAS, CEDEAO, right? So there is a political objective to create a single currency, the ECO, for WAMZ, member countries, so West African Monetary Zone, which includes Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. And then there is a plan to merge the ECO with the CFA franc by 2020 and have one currency for West Africa. So potential benefits from having this one currency and the ECOWAS monetary union include again increased regional integration and also improved macroeconomic climate if countries are able to stick to convergence criteria. Now, again, there is a literature on optimal currency area, and again, this is an interesting area for research, and you know, it is based on the fact that to have an optimal currency area, you have to have face similar shocks, right? So, the more similar your shocks are, the more advantages you have from having a currency area. And some studies argue that, well, in the case of ECOWAS, because of Nigeria and the sheer size of Nigeria, and the fact that Nigeria is a big oil exporter, there might be some challenges to really integrate smaller countries with Nigeria, different countries with Nigeria. So for example, this paper, which is a bit dated, I think I would invite the researchers to have a look at this and maybe think about some follow-up. It's an IMF paper by Paul Masson and Cathy Patillo, which kind of did some simulation to calculate the welfare effects of economic integration. And you'll see here Nigeria will gain a lot, but some other countries will not. Whatever the case, the political agenda, the policy is set, and we are moving there, but as I said, what's important, and I'll come back to that, is the journey and what we do to get there. Now, another issue also is that the CFA franc, because it's one of the tools of the monetary union, comes paired with these convergence criteria, right? So, why do we have convergence criteria in the monetary union? Well, we have them because they are designed to make member countries similar enough to be well served by a common currency and a common monetary policy, right? The closer you look alike, the more efficient monetary policy will be, the more efficient your gains, your welfare gains will be. So the higher your welfare gains will be. So we have first order criteria and second order criteria. For example, as first order criteria, we have the overall fiscal balance to GDP ratio, which should be less or equal to 3%. We have average inflation, CPI, which should not exceed 3%. We have an overall debt to GDP ratio that should not exceed 70%. And we have some other second order criteria, like a wage bill to tax receipt ratio, which should not exceed 35%, and tax revenues to GDP ratio that should be equal or to or over 20%. So what has been the performance? So this is from the latest IMF report on the region, the surveillance report on the region, and it shows the number of countries that are non-compliant with the criteria. Okay, so if you look at the year 2014, for example, when it comes to CPI or total debt to GDP, all the countries are compliant, so hence the zero. Okay, of course, the CPI number there is also one benefit of having a peg to the euro as we're importing inflation. The peg of the CFA franc to the euro helps in creating macroeconomic stability in the region. And if you look at over a long-term period, the CFA franc zone outperforms fellow sub-Saharan countries in some dimensions, which I will elaborate in a minute. And as we have seen recently, in some CFA franc countries where we have political instability, like Mali, Burkina Faso, and in the year 2000 and so on in Côte d'Ivoire, the peg preserved, right, the stability of the currency. So this is from a 2008 paper, but still it looks at a very long series from 1960 to 2004, looking at the averages of inflation rate, the volatility of inflation and fiscal deficit compared the countries with a CFA franc and the countries without the CFA franc. And the result was, not surprisingly really, that the CFA franc country had less inflation volatility, and relatively less fiscal deficit. So now the question is then, okay, we have macroeconomic stability, but is that enough, right? Can the region really leverage its macroeconomic stability to grow faster, to attract investment and be more competitive? What is the region's performance on these two dimensions, and what can be done, right? So we have a union, we have a monetary union, we have a common currency, we have high regional intertrade, we have a low inflation, we have macro stability, we have some convergence criteria which we try to comply to. So, but are we growing as fast as we can? Are we attracting investment as much as we can? So, if you again look at some selected indicators like GDP growth, trade deficit, fiscal deficit, or some measure of competitiveness, real effective exchange rate, the results there are mixed really. So if you look at GDP growth, which is the first, the left-hand side of the graph, you have the Western African Monetary Union figures in red. You see that, well, before 1994, which was the date of the devaluation of the CFA franc, we were not growing as fast as the rest of the continent. After the devaluation, we managed to grow faster until 1998. But then, since then, other countries, on average, are growing faster, right? So, mixed. If you look at the trade deficit, which is the second bar chart, before the devaluation, we were really importing much more Then we were exporting with a strong currency compared to other African countries, and it's still the case. If you look at fiscal deficit, we were lower, and we're still lower, but the comparative advantage has decreased. And if you look at the real effective exchange rate, and here, if it goes, the higher it is, the higher your inflation, or the higher your nominal exchange rate appreciation. So we had high real effective exchange rate, so we were less competitive, and although we had gain in competitiveness, this was not a silver bullet really, compared to other countries. So just to summarize this, mixed really impact, mixed results from having the CFA franc as a peg, not as a common currency, but as a peg. And now this is one of my favorite graphs, because what I did here is I took all the external flows, all the money coming into Africa. So I took aid money. I just used the ODA data from the OECD DAC. Then I took remittances from the World Bank data. And then I took foreign direct investment from the IMF data. And I also compare all of this to government revenues. And what I did is I computed an average for sub-Saharan Africa, and then I looked at how you deviate from that average, right? So, in red, you have the West African Economic Monetary Union, and if you look at on your right-hand side where it says private capital, you see that the Western African Monetary Union is the region that attracts the least foreign direct investment compared to other regional economic communities, right? So this is also a relatively poor performance in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. In terms of remittances, it's not that bad, but you have countries like Nigeria. Senegal gets a lot of remittances, more than 10% of GDP, but Nigeria also does the same, and so on. But my point here really was, in terms of competitiveness, I showed the real effective exchange rate as one measure of competitiveness. Here I just wanted to show the attractiveness of the region as a destination for foreign direct investment, in spite of having a peg to the euro, which from a European perspective reduces the currency risk to zero. So in spite of that, in spite of having the EU as our largest trading partner, we receive the least FDI compared to other regional economic communities. And then, how has the structure of our economies changed over time? You'll see that this is pretty flat, right? But this is true for Africa as a whole. But we haven't changed the structure of our economies, still dependent on agriculture and services. Manufacturing has not grown. And this has effect on poverty. Why? Because as we grow, in the previous presentation, Professor Leonard showed that Sub-Saharan Africa is the region that reduced poverty the least, in spite of growing fast, right? So this elasticity is very low in Africa. And one possibility could be because of the structure of the economy, like in Asia, right? Because of the growth of manufacturing, right? The poverty went down as a much higher rate, right? As people move from agriculture to manufacturing. And we haven't changed the structure of our economy, right? So, this leads me to the last question that I have after looking at the CFA franc as a tool for integration, after looking at the CFA franc as a tool for stability, macro stability. The question is the CFA franc and competitiveness, right? So the countries in this union, the 8 countries, have chosen to integrate their economies through a common currency and have chosen that this common currency should be pegged, right, to the euro. And we know that a fixed exchange rate regime has pros and cons, right? And one of the drawbacks of a fixed exchange rate regime is the risk of losing competitiveness. For example, in here, I just summarized a paper by Frankel, who just summarized the advantages and drawbacks of fixed exchange rate versus floating exchange rate. This is well known, but you would see that as a drawback of fixed exchange rate, you have the loss of competitiveness, the possible loss of competitiveness. Okay? So, an interesting fact is that even though in 1994 the CFA franc was devalued by 50% vis-à-vis the euro to gain competitiveness, this was not a silver bullet, right? It was definitely not a silver bullet. And this leads me to the point that the fixed exchange rate is not the only impediment to the challenges of competitiveness in the region. So we also have to look at the structural barriers to competition in the West African Monetary Union. And this will involve taking a serious look at the institutional environment, at the quality of infrastructure, and so on. So if you look at, this is from the World Economic Forum, and it's the Global Competitiveness Index, right? For the whole globe, you see that Africa as a whole is less competitive. But if you compare, for example, of course, it's not a fair comparison because of South Africa, but if you look at the Southern Cone, the SADC region, compared to the Western African Monetary Union, or you compare the East African Community, this union, we still have some gains in competitiveness that needs to be achieved there. So if you take Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Burkina, and you look at the index number, we are towards the median, right? So still some room to grow if you want to compete globally or you want to compete regionally. If you take the World Bank Ease of Doing Business indicators again, you take Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Mali, Togo, Senegal, Benin, Niger, with Guinea-Bissau being the laggard for clear reasons. It's a fragile country. We are again towards the median. Again, some potential for improvement.